The story of Thomas, a father's sacrifice. Thomas had always been a man of few words. He wasn't the type to share his feelings openly or to boast about his accomplishments. He had always lived simply, worked hard, and kept his head down. But to his kids, Sarah and Luke, he was a giant, a quiet hero in a world that didn't always seem fair. He was just a regular man. No special powers, no extraordinary talents. He worked as a mechanic in a small town, fixing cars and trucks, doing what he could to make sure his family was taken care of. His wife, Emily, had passed away when Sarah was only 3, and Luke was just a baby. From that day, Thomas had vowed to give them the world, even if he had nothing to offer but the strength of his hands and the love in his heart. The town was quiet, peaceful for the most part, but the world outside had a way of creeping in, reminding Thomas that life could change in an instant. His kids grew up too fast. Sarah, at 14, had already developed a sharp wit and a tenderness that reminded him so much of Emily. Luke, at 10, was a dreamer, always coming up with wild ideas and asking questions about the world. They were both his everything. But Thomas knew deep down that there was a weight on his shoulders that would one day come crashing down. It started one late afternoon in October, just a week before his 42nd birthday. A heavy storm had rolled in, the kind that made the sky seem darker than it should be. Thomas had been working late in the shop, fixing an old truck that had been brought in just hours earlier. The rain came down in torrents, beating against the windows, and the wind howled like it was angry. Thomas looked out the shop window and saw a flash of lightning illuminate the sky, followed by a deafening crack of thunder. He knew something was wrong. He couldn't explain it, just a feeling that crawled down his spine. His phone buzzed in his pocket. It was Sarah. "Dad, there's something wrong. The lights are flickering and the basement's flooding." Her voice was shaky, but she was trying to stay calm. "Stay upstairs, honey," Thomas said, trying to hide the panic that had already begun to rise in his chest. "I'll be home in just a few minutes. Don't go down there." But before he could finish the sentence, the phone went dead. His heart raced. The storm had knocked out power in several parts of the town, and Thomas knew the streets were going to be treacherous. He grabbed his jacket, his keys, and ran out of the shop into the storm, determined to get home to his kids, no matter what. As he drove down the slick road, the rain was relentless. He could barely see anything beyond the windshield, but his only thought was getting to Sarah and Luke. The world seemed to blur as he raced through the downpour, heart pounding, his hands gripped tightly on the wheel. The wind howled so loudly he could barely hear his own thoughts. Then, as if the storm itself was a force beyond his control, the truck in front of him suddenly swerved, and the road became a blur of rain, debris, and chaos. Thomas swerved to avoid the crash, but his tires lost grip, and he slid into the guardrail. The world seemed to stop as the impact jolted his body. Pain, darkness, but he couldn't stop. He couldn't give in, not when his kids needed him. He pulled himself out of the wreckage, his body screaming in pain, and stumbled down the road. He knew the house wasn't far. Every step felt like an eternity, but he pushed on. His legs burned, his head spun, but he couldn't stop. He wouldn't stop. When he reached the house, it was chaos. Water was pouring into the basement windows, flooding the floors, the walls, rising faster than Thomas could comprehend. He heard Luke's voice calling for him and Sarah's frantic shout. He ran through the house, his feet slipping on the wet floor until he found them in the kitchen. Luke was huddled in a corner, his face pale with fear, and Sarah was trying to move furniture to block the rising water. "Dad, the water's rising so fast. What do we do?" Sarah cried, her voice filled with panic. Thomas didn't waste time with words. He grabbed Luke and pulled him into his arms, whispering that everything would be okay. He instructed Sarah to grab whatever they could, blankets, pillows, anything that would keep them above the water. The basement was flooding quickly. There was no way to stop it. Thomas knew that if they didn't get to higher ground soon, they would be trapped. "Listen to me, Sarah," Thomas said, his voice steady despite the terror that gripped his heart. "I'm going to get you two to the roof. There's a ladder on the back of the shed. We'll climb up. Stay there until help comes. Do you understand?" Sarah nodded, her eyes wide with fear, but she trusted him. Luke's small hands gripped his father's shirt, but Thomas could feel the strength in his son's grip. and it made him proud. They scrambled to the back of the house, the water already rising to their ankles. The wind whipped at them, but they made it to the ladder, and Thomas helped Sarah climb first, then Luke, before following behind them. The wind was brutal, the storm still raging, but they were safe for the moment. As they huddled on a roof, cold and wet, Thomas looked at his kids and felt a bittersweet sense of relief. They were alive. They were safe. But he knew that time was running out. The storm showed no signs of stopping, and the water in the streets continued to rise. They could hear the distant sound of emergency sirens. But Thomas knew it would take time for them to get to their house. He looked at his children, their faces pale with fear, and his heart clenched. "I love you both so much," he whispered, his voice breaking. Sarah looked at him, her eyes wide with confusion. "What's wrong, Dad?" But before he could answer, the rooftop started to creak under the weight of the water that was flooding in beneath them. The wind howled louder, and Thomas felt the pressure in his chest increase. His breath came in shallow gasps as he realized they were running out of time. "Listen to me," he said urgently, pulling them closer. "I'm going to make sure you both get out of here. No matter what, you're going to be okay." Then, in one final act of love, Thomas stood up, facing the rising floodwaters that were closing in on them. With every ounce of strength he had left, he climbed down the ladder, gripping the side of the house as the water churned beneath him. "I'll hold the ladder steady," he shouted to Sarah, who was watching him, fear and confusion in her eyes. As the storm raged on, the waters continued to rise, but Sarah and Luke made it to safety, thanks to their father. Thomas's strength gave them the time they needed. He held on just long enough to ensure they were out of danger before the water finally overtook him. By the time help arrived, it was too late. The storm had taken him. But Sarah and Luke, his two children, were alive, and in their hearts, they would always carry the love and sacrifice of a father who had given everything for them. Thomas had always been quiet, but in the end his actions spoke louder than any words ever could. He had sacrificed his life for theirs, and in doing so had shown them the true meaning of love, a love that was unconditional, unyielding, and eternal.